Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing mysteries hidden beneath the golden facade of French aristocracy. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can, not through supernatural horror, but through the cold, terrible reality of lives deemed so insignificant that their disappearances barely caused a ripple in the historical record. We're about to delve into a mystery that unfolded in the shadow of Versailles itself, where young servant girls vanished without explanation and left behind a legacy so carefully buried that 3 centuries passed before anyone thought to ask what happened to them, where the glittering world of French nobility concealed darkness in its very foundations. It was the year 1693. Louis Roman XIV, the Sun King, was at the zenith of his power, ruling France from the most magnificent palace ever constructed by human hands. Versailles sprawled across thousands of acres, its hall of mirrors reflecting candlelight from 10,000 flames, its gardens stretching toward horizons manicured into geometric perfection. Europe watched France with equal parts envy and fear. The Sun King's court set the standard for civilization itself, or so the world believed. But beneath the parquet floors where nobles danced, below the kitchens where sauces simmered in copper pots, there existed another Versailles entirely. A world of cramped passages and airless rooms, of servants who rose before dawn and collapsed after midnight, of young girls brought from the countryside with promises of decent wages and returned to their villages in wooden boxes, if they returned at all. This is the story the palace never wanted told. The Palace of Versailles in 1693 was not merely a residence. It was a living organism, a breathing entity that consumed resources at a pace that would have bankrupted smaller nations. 10,000 courtiers lived within its walls at any given time, along with 4,000 servants who made their existence possible. But those numbers only told part of the story. Beyond the official staff, beyond the ledgers and the payrolls, existed a shadow workforce. Girls as young as 12, brought from villages across France, employed through informal arrangements, paid in coins pressed directly into their palms with no record kept. They scrubbed the thousands of chamber pots each morning. They carried endless buckets of water up narrow servants' stairs. They washed the mountains of linens soiled by nobles who changed their clothes 3 times daily. They emptied the privies, they hauled the ashes, they cleaned the blood from the kitchen floors where animals were slaughtered to feed the insatiable court. And sometimes they disappeared. The Ile-de-France region surrounding Versailles was characterized by gently rolling hills and dense forests of oak and beech. Small villages dotted the landscape, places where families had farmed the same land for generations, where everyone knew everyone else's name, where the arrival of a stranger was an event discussed. For weeks, these villages supplied Versailles with more than just grain and meat. They supplied the palace with its most expendable resource, their daughters. Recruiters came regularly, welled, rest men who spoke of opportunity in voices smooth as silk. They described the palace as a place where even a maid might see more splendor in a day than most people witnessed in a lifetime. They promised wages that seemed generous to families who counted their wealth in chickens and sacks of flour. They assured worried parents that their daughters would be housed, fed, and chaperoned properly. What they didn't mention were the conditions. The 18-hour workdays, the cold, the casual cruelty. The fact that a girl who displeased her employers might find herself dismissed without warning or wages, left to make her own way home through countryside where a woman alone faced dangers that polite society preferred not to discuss. And they certainly didn't mention that some girls never made it home at all. Pacing note: slow, atmospheric establishment. Allow the contrast between surface glamour and underlying darkness to build gradually. Marguerite Bellancourt was 15 years old in the spring of 1693 when the recruiter came to her village of Saint Leger in Yvelines. She was the second of 5 daughters born to a farming family who worked land they didn't own, paying most of their harvest to an absentee landlord they'd never seen. The winter had been harsh. The spring planting had gone poorly. When the recruiter described a position at Versailles that would pay 6 livres per month, more than her father made in 3, Marguerite's mother had wept with relief. The girl who left Saint Leger that April morning was small for her age. With dark hair she kept braided tightly, and hands already calloused from farm work. She could read a little. The village priest had taught the children their letters, and she could count well enough. She knew how to work until her body screamed for rest. She thought she knew what hardship meant. She would soon learn how wrong she was. The journey to Versailles took 2 days by wagon. Marguerite traveled with 3 other girls from nearby villages, all around the same age, all wearing their best dresses, which meant clean, mended, and only slightly too small. They chattered nervously about what awaited them. One girl, Anne Marie from a village to the north, had a cousin who'd worked at Versailles 2 years prior and sent home glowing reports. Another, Catherine, had brought a small wooden cross her grandmother had pressed into her hands, whispering prayers of protection. The third girl, Jean, said little. She was older than the others, perhaps 17, with suspicious eyes and a mouth set in a permanent line of distrust. When the others speculated about the palace, she remained silent. When they arrived at Versailles and the others gasped at the scale of the golden gates, Jean only nodded, as if confirming something she'd already known. They entered through the servants' entrance, not the grand gates the nobles used, but a narrow passage near the south wing that led directly to the service areas. The contrast between the palace's public face and its working interior was immediate and stark. The gilded halls gave way within steps to plain corridors with walls of exposed stone. The soaring ceilings dropped to heights that barely cleared a tall man's head. The air changed from the perfumed atmosphere of the staterooms to something thick with the smell of cooking fat, smoke, and too many bodies living in too little space. Their supervisor was a woman named Madame Genevieve, head of the lower maids. She was perhaps 40, though she looked older, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that assessed the new arrivals with the cold precision of a butcher evaluating livestock. She didn't welcome them. She didn't smile. She simply began issuing instructions in a voice that assumed absolute obedience. You'll sleep in the south servants' quarters, 6 to a room. You'll rise at 4 in the morning when the bell rings. Anyone who sleeps through the bell will be beaten. You'll work until the evening. Bell at 9, sometimes later. You'll be fed twice daily, morning and evening. If you're caught stealing food, you'll be dismissed without wages. If you're caught alone with a male servant, you'll be dismissed without wages. If you become pregnant, you'll be dismissed without wages. Do you understand? The girls nodded. I didn't hear you. Yes, madame, they chorused. Your wages will be held until the end of your first 6 months of service. This ensures you don't simply run off after a week. If you leave before 6 months, you forfeit all pay. Do you understand? Again, they agreed. What choice did they have? They'd already come too far to turn back. Madame Genevieve led them through a maze of corridors that seemed to fold back on themselves. The palace was far larger than any of them had imagined, not just large, but labyrinthine, a warren of passages and staircases that connected the various service areas while keeping servants invisible to the nobles who depended on them. One could walk from the kitchens to the third floor bedchambers without ever stepping into a public corridor. provided one knew the secret geography of the walls. The servants' quarters occupied a section of the palace that tourists would never see. Narrow rooms with low ceilings, each containing 6 straw mattresses on the floor, one small window covered with oiled cloth rather than glass, and nothing else. No furniture, no privacy, no warmth. The fireplaces that heated the nobles' apartments didn't extend to these spaces. In winter, the servants slept in their clothes, huddled together for warmth. Marguerite was assigned to a room with 5 other girls, including her traveling companions and 2 others who'd been at Versailles for several months already. These veterans eyed the newcomers with an expression Marguerite couldn't quite read. Not quite pity, not quite warning, something between the two. That first night, lying on straw that poked through the thin mattress, Marguerite listened to the sounds of the palace settling around her. Footsteps in distant corridors, muffled voices, the creak of old wood and the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls. Somewhere far above, she could hear music, a harpsichord playing something delicate and beautiful. The sound seemed to come from another world entirely. Anne, Marie, lying on the mattress beside her, reached out in the darkness and found Marguerite's hand. Neither spoke. They simply held on to each other, 2 frightened girls a long way from home. In the darkness, Jean's voice came, flat and certain. "Some girls don't last here." "What do you mean?" Catherine whispered. "Just what I said. Some girls don't last." No one asked her to explain. Perhaps they didn't want to know. The work began before dawn. The bell that woke the servants was not melodious like the church bells that called nobles to chapel. It was harsh, insistent, designed to drag even the deepest sleepers into consciousness. In the darkness before sunrise, the servants' quarters came alive with movement, girls dressing in the clothes they'd slept in, splashing cold water on their faces from shared buckets, braiding their hair with fingers still clumsy from sleep. Marguerite's assignment was to the lower scullery, the massive kitchen area where the preliminary food preparation occurred. This was considered the worst placement for a new servant. The scullery was hot in summer and cold in winter, perpetually damp, filled with steam and smoke and the smell of things both cooking and rotting. The work was endless, mountains of vegetables to scrub, cauldrons large enough to bathe in that needed scouring, floors that required constant mopping because the combination of water, grease, and foot traffic created a perpetual slurry of filth. The scullery operated in a strict hierarchy. At the top were the cooks, men who'd trained for years to master the art of French cuisine. Below them were the assistant cooks, still male, who handled the more complex preparations. Then came the kitchen maids, who did the chopping and the basic cooking. And at the very bottom, scraping against the foundation stones of the social order, were the scullery maids like Marguerite. Her supervisor in the scullery was a woman named Marie Claire, a kitchen maid who'd risen from the scullery herself and seemed determined to make certain no one else had an easier time than she had. Marie Claire's primary tool of management was her voice. She could curse in ways that would have made soldiers blush, stringing together insults with a creativity that might have been impressive in other circumstances. She never struck the girls under her supervision, but her words could leave wounds that lasted longer than bruises. Within a week, Marguerite's hands were raw and bleeding. The combination of hot water, harsh soap, and abrasive scrubbing had stripped away the calluses she'd developed on the farm and exposed tender flesh beneath. Marie Claire glanced at Marguerite's torn skin and shrugged. "Wrap them in cloth if you need to. The work doesn't stop because you're soft." But Marguerite wasn't complaining. She'd come here to work, and work she would. What troubled her more than the physical demands was the atmosphere in the servants' quarters. a combination of exhaustion, fear, and something else she couldn't quite name. The other servants spoke in whispers. They flinched at sudden noises. And they seemed to avoid certain areas of the palace entirely, even when doing so meant taking much longer routes to complete their tasks. 1 month after her arrival, during the brief evening meal when the servants could sit and rest, Marguerite finally asked the question that had been building in her mind. Why does everyone avoid the north cellar passage? The conversation around her stopped. 6 girls looked at her with expressions ranging from surprise to alarm. One of the older servants, a girl named Lisette, who'd been at Versailles for nearly 2 years, set down her bread carefully. "Who told you about the north cellar passage?" "No one. I noticed that everyone takes the long way around, even when using that passage would save 10 minutes. Lisette glanced at the others before speaking. "Girls have gone missing from that area." "Missing how?" "Missing as in they went down those stairs and never came back up." Marguerite felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean they never came back up? Did they get lost?" "The palace is large, but it's not that large, and these girls knew their way around. They just disappeared." Catherine, who'd traveled to Versailles with Marguerite, leaned forward. "How many? I don't know exactly. 4, 5, maybe more before I got here." Lisette's voice dropped even lower. "Madame Genevieve says they ran away, that they were lazy and didn't want to work, so they snuck out in the night and went home. But you don't believe that." "I believe that when a girl disappears, Madame Genevieve has a new one hired within the week. I believe that no one seems to think it's strange that girls keep vanishing from the same area. And I believe that when you ask too many questions, you're the next one to be assigned tasks in the north cellar." The silence that followed this statement was heavy with implications. Jean, who'd been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "My cousin worked here 3 years ago. She wrote home regularly every month, like clockwork. Then the letters stopped. My aunt and uncle came to Versailles to check on her. Madame Genevieve told them she'd run off with a soldier, said she'd probably gone to Paris and they'd never find her. They searched for 2 months, never found any trace." "And you still came here?" Marguerite asked. Jean's smile was bitter. "My family needs the money, and I thought, maybe I'm clever enough not to disappear. Maybe if I'm careful, if I don't ask questions, if I do exactly what I'm told." She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Fact-check flag. Historical records of servants at Versailles are notoriously incomplete. While the general working conditions described here are well documented, specific disappearances would require verification from court records and local church registers. The number of unofficial servants at any given time is estimated but not precisely known. The conversation haunted Marguerite in the weeks that followed. She became aware of things she'd previously missed, small details that suddenly seemed significant. The way Madame Genevieve's ledgers never seemed to quite match the number of girls actually working in the palace. The fact that when a servant disappeared, her belongings were cleared out and redistributed with disturbing efficiency, as if her existence had been planned to be temporary. The locked doors in certain areas, doors that had no apparent purpose, that led to rooms no one was permitted to enter. And then there was the smell. It drifted through certain corridors at certain times, always at night, always in the areas where the oldest parts of the palace met the new construction. It was faint, easily dismissed as the odor of old stone and mold that permeated any large, old building. But sometimes, when the wind blew from certain directions, the smell grew stronger, taking on a quality that made Marguerite's stomach turn. She mentioned it once to Marie-Claire, who'd been scrubbing a pot with particular violence. The kitchen maid had frozen for just a moment before resuming her work. Old palaces smell like old palaces. Marie Claire said, "That's all." But this smell is, "That's all," Marie Claire repeated, her voice sharp with warning. "You'll live longer if you learn not to notice things." It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging that something was deeply wrong. Summer turned to autumn. The palace prepared for the king's return from a military campaign. Thousands of servants worked day and night to ensure everything was perfect for His Majesty's arrival. Marguerite, who'd been at Versailles for 5 months now, had learned to move through the servants' corridors with the efficiency of long practice. She knew which staircases were fastest, which passages were least crowded, where one could steal a moment's rest without being observed. She also knew which areas to avoid. The north cellar passage was one, but there were others. A series of storage rooms near the foundation where the palace sat on older construction, possibly medieval, possibly older still. A section of corridor near the southeast corner that somehow felt wrong in a way Marguerite couldn't articulate. And a staircase that descended past the main cellars into darkness, closed off by a door that was always locked, always guarded. One evening in October, as Marguerite was returning from emptying chamber pots in the waste area, she encountered Anne Marie in a state of near hysteria. The girl was pressed against a wall, breathing in short, sharp gasps, her eyes wide with terror. What happened? Marguerite grasped her friend's shoulders. "I saw, in the passage, there was Anne." Marie couldn't seem to form complete sentences. "Breathe. Tell me what you saw." "A door. It was open, just for a moment, and inside there was—" Anne Marie's voice dropped to a whisper. "Bones, human bones, just piled there like firewood." Marguerite felt the world tilt. "Where? Which door?" "Near the north cellar. One of the storage rooms. It's locked now. I don't. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe in the darkness I saw wrong." But they both knew she hadn't imagined anything. That night, Marguerite lay awake long after the others had fallen into exhausted sleep. She thought about the girls who'd disappeared, about her own family back in St. Leger, who were depending on the wages she'd send home after her 6 months were complete, about the locked doors and the strange smells and the way people's eyes slid away when certain questions were asked. She thought about Anne Marie's frightened face, and she made a decision that would change everything. Pacing note: the tension should be building steadily here. Each revelation should feel like another piece falling into place, creating a picture that's increasingly disturbing. The next morning, Marguerite did something forbidden. Instead of going directly to the scullery, she detoured through the main palace corridors, the ones servants were supposed to use only when actively working in the nobles' quarters. She needed to reach someone in authority, someone outside the servants' hierarchy, someone who might actually care that girls were disappearing. She had no plan beyond this, no thought about what she would actually say, or how she would avoid being dismissed immediately for breaking protocol. She only knew that silence had become impossible. The palace in the early morning was quiet. Most of the nobles were still asleep, and the servants moved through the halls like ghosts, silent and efficient. Marguerite climbed the servants' stairs to the second floor, where she knew the king's ministers had their offices. She had some vague idea of presenting herself to a secretary, of explaining that something terrible was happening below stairs, of asking for help. She never made it that far. "You, what are you doing here?" Marguerite turned to find Madame Genevieve standing at the end of the corridor. The older woman's face was a mask of fury. I needed to speak with. Servants do not wander the nobles' corridors. You know this." Madame Genevieve strode toward her, and Marguerite saw something in her eyes that made her take a step backward. "You were trying to go upstairs, weren't you?" trying to bother your betters with some complaint. Girls are disappearing, Marguerite said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Anne, Marie saw bones. There are locked rooms. I think someone is. The slap came so fast Marguerite didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, and she tasted blood. Stupid, stupid girl. Madame Genevieve's voice was low and dangerous. Do you have any idea what you've done? I'm trying to. You're trying to get yourself killed. The older woman glanced down the corridor, then grabbed Marguerite's arm with surprising strength. Come with me, now. Marguerite had no choice but to follow as Madame Genevieve dragged her through passages and downstairs, moving deeper into the palace than Marguerite had ever gone before. They passed the main cellars, descended past the storage areas, went through a door Marguerite hadn't known existed. The air here was different, colder, damper. The walls were older stone, darker, slick with moisture that seemed to seep from the rock itself. The smell that Marguerite had noticed before was stronger here, unmistakable now in its terrible implications. Please, Marguerite whispered, I don't want to go down there. What you want has never mattered. Madame Genevieve's grip didn't loosen. But I'm going to do you one mercy, because I remember when I was young and stupid like you. I'm going to show you exactly why you should have kept your mouth shut, and then you're going to have a choice to make. They reached a door. Madame Genevieve produced a key from somewhere in her dress and unlocked it. The door swung open on hinges that creaked with disuse. Beyond was darkness. In, Madame Genevieve commanded, shoving Marguerite forward. Marguerite stumbled into the room. Behind her, she heard the scrape of flint and steel, and then light bloomed as Madame Genevieve lit a torch mounted on the wall. The room was small, circular, with walls of ancient stone that predated Versailles itself. It was empty except for a single object in the center. A well, old, deep, sealed with an iron grate, and from below came sounds that no well should make, movement, whispers, and underneath it all, a smell that could no longer be mistaken for anything but what it was, the stench of death. You wanted to know where the girls go, Madame Genevieve said. Her voice was flat now, emptied of emotion. There's your answer. Marguerite stared into the darkness beyond the grate. She couldn't see the bottom. She didn't want to. How many? Her voice came out as a croak. I stopped counting years ago. Why? For the first time, Madame Genevieve's face showed something other than anger. For just a moment, she looked tired, old, defeated. Because this palace was built on older foundations, and those foundations were built on older structures still. Because there are rooms beneath Versailles that existed long before the Sun King decided to build his monument to glory. Because some of those rooms were used for purposes that history has forgotten, and some of us were unlucky enough to discover what those purposes were. She gestured at the well. This is where the palace disposes of its inconveniences, always has been, probably always will be. The nobles, they must not know. Madame Genevieve laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The nobles don't care. A servant girl disappears, hire another, they're easily replaced, cheaper than horses and less likely to be missed. We have to tell someone, the authorities. I am the authorities as far as you're concerned, and here's your choice, girl. You forget everything you've seen and heard. You go back to the scullery. You work your 6 months and collect you wages and go home to your village. You never speak of this again. Or, Madame Genevieve gestured toward the well. The meaning was clear. You're a monster, Marguerite whispered. I'm a survivor. There's a difference. Madame Genevieve extinguished the torch, plunging them back into darkness. Now make your choice. Marguerite made her choice, but it wasn't the choice Madame Genevieve expected. She returned to the scullery. She worked through the day in silence, scrubbing pots until her raw hands bled into the water, carrying buckets until her back screamed in protest. She spoke to no one. She kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. But that night, after the evening bell, after the other girls had fallen into exhausted sleep, Marguerite lay awake and thought about the well, about the bones Marie had seen, about the girls who'd vanished, and about her own sister back home, who was already asking their mother when she could come to Versailles too. She thought about survival versus complicity, and she decided that some things mattered more than staying alive. The Palace of Versailles employed more than just servants. It also employed a small garrison of guards, men responsible for maintaining order and investigating crimes within the palace grounds. Marguerite knew that going to them was dangerous. Madame Genevieve had made clear the consequences of speaking. But she also knew that the only way to truly escape this place was to expose what it was. The next morning, Marguerite asked permission to visit the chapel, a request that couldn't be easily denied, as even servants were expected to maintain some semblance of religious devotion. Instead of going to the chapel, she made her way to the guards' quarters, a separate building near the palace's north wing. She expected to be turned away immediately. Instead, she found herself face to face with a young guard named Lieutenant Francois Delacroix, a man in his early 30s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough of world to know that appearances could be deceiving. "I need to report a crime," Marguerite said. Delacroix studied her. "What kind of crime?" "Murder, multiple murders. Girls have been disappearing from the servants' quarters, and I know where they've been put." Something changed in Delacroix's expression. "You're not the first person to say something like this. What happened to the others who reported it?" "They disappeared." The words hung in the air between them. "Will you help me anyway?" Marguerite asked. Delacroix was silent for a long moment. "Then, I've been at Versailles for 3 years. In that time, I've filed reports on 12 disappearances of young servants, all female, all between the ages of 12 and 18. Every report was dismissed. I was told the girls had run away or gone home or eloped with soldiers. I was told to stop wasting time on nonsense." He leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Fact-check flag. Lieutenant Delacroix is a fictional character, but the position of lieutenant in the palace guard is historically accurate. Records of internal investigations at Versailles are fragmentary at best, making verification of specific cases impossible. Marguerite told him about the North Cellar Passage, about the locked rooms and the strange smells, about Marie seeing bones, about Madame Genevieve taking her to the well and making her choose between silence and death. When she finished, Delacroix sat back in his chair. "If what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, then we're dealing with something that goes beyond a single person's actions. Madame Genevieve is middle management at best. Someone higher up must be protecting this. Can you investigate? Can you get into those rooms?" "Not without permission from my commanding officer, who has already made clear that he considers servant disappearances beneath his notice. If I push too hard, I'll find myself reassigned to some garrison in the provinces." Delacroix drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking. "But there might be another way. The king has returned from campaign. He's holding audiences this week. If we can get your testimony to someone close to him, someone who actually cares about justice, we might be able to force an official investigation." "How do we do that?" "Leave it to me. In the meantime, you need to be careful. If Madame Genevieve discovers you've spoken to me, she'll act quickly." Marguerite nodded. "How long will it take?" "A few days, maybe a week. Can you last that long?" "I don't have much choice." As Marguerite turned to leave, Delacroix called after her. Why are you doing this? You could have just kept your head down, finished your 6 months, gone home. Marguerite thought about the well, about the darkness, about the girls who'd been thrown away like refuse, because someone has to. She said simply. The next 3 days were the longest of Marguerite's life. She returned to the scullery, to the endless work, to the other girls who watched her with worried eyes because everyone could sense that something had changed. Marguerite no longer moved through the palace with the resigned acceptance of the powerless. She moved with purpose. With determination, Madame Genevieve noticed. On the 3rd night, the older woman appeared in the servants' quarters after the evening bell. Marguerite Bellancourt, come with me. The other girls went silent. Everyone knew what those words meant. Marguerite stood slowly beside her and Marie grabbed her hand. Don't go. I have to. You don't have to do anything. Anne Marie's voice was fierce with sudden courage. We're not slaves. We can refuse. And then what? She'll just come back with guards and take me by force. At least this way. Marguerite squeezed her friend's hand once, then let go. At least this way I choose to walk. She followed Madame Genevieve through the familiar corridors, down the familiar stairs. But this time they weren't going to the room with the well. They were going somewhere else. A small office near the servants' quarters where Madame Genevieve conducted her administrative business. The older woman closed the door behind them and locked it. You spoke to the guards. It wasn't a question. Yes, stupid girl, I gave you a chance to walk away. You gave me a chance to become complicit in murder. I chose differently. Madame Genevieve moved to her desk and withdrew a small knife. The kind used for opening letters, but sharp enough to do other work as well. You understand I can't let you continue. Marguerite's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. You understand that killing me won't stop what's coming. I've already told them everything. Lieutenant Delacroix has my testimony. Even if I die, the investigation will continue. Delacroix. Madame Genevieve spat the name. That self-righteous fool. He's filed his reports before. Nothing came of them. Nothing will come of this. You sound less certain than you'd like to. For the first time, Marguerite saw real fear in Madame Genevieve's eyes. You don't understand what you've done. You think this is about me. I'm nothing. I'm following orders, same as you. But the people who give those orders, they don't like loose ends. Then help me. Marguerite said urgently, tell me who's responsible. Help me bring them to justice, and maybe... The door burst open. Lieutenant Delacroix stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 other guards. Behind them, impossibly, stood a nobleman in elaborate dress, a man whose face Marguerite had never seen, but whose presence commanded immediate recognition of authority. Madame Genevieve, the nobleman said in a voice cold as winter, you will put down that weapon. The knife clattered to the floor. Mademoiselle Bellancourt. The nobleman continued, Lieutenant Delacroix has shared your testimony with me. I am the Duc de Saint, Simon, advisor to His Majesty. I want you to show me these rooms you spoke of, these locked doors, this well. Marguerite couldn't quite believe this was happening. You believe me. I believe that something is very wrong in my king's palace. Whether it's what you describe or something else, I intend to discover the truth. Saint, Simon turned to Delacroix. Bring her. Madame Genevieve made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. You're fools, all of you. You think finding a few bodies will matter. You think you'll be able to prosecute anyone who matters. The palace protects its own. The palace. Saint, Simon said coldly, serves the king, and the king serves justice, or so we claim. Let us see if those words have any meaning. Asterisk asterisk historical note. The Duc de Saint. Simon was a real historical figure, a nobleman and memoirist who documented life at Versailles with often brutal honesty. His memoirs provide some of our best sources for understanding the palace's inner workings. Whether he would have intervened in a case like this is speculative, but his writings suggest he was disturbed by the casual cruelty of court life. The investigation that followed became the scandal that Versailles tried desperately to suppress. With Marguerite as their guide and Madame Genevieve under arrest, Lieutenant Delacroix and the Duc de Saint Simon explored the hidden spaces of the palace. They descended into the cellars. They unlocked the forbidden doors, and they discovered the truth that generations of servants had whispered about in the darkness. The well that Madame Genevieve had shown Marguerite was real. When they removed the iron grate, the smell that rose from below made even the hardened soldiers gag. They lowered torches into the darkness, and what the light revealed confirmed Marguerite's worst fears. The well descended perhaps 30 feet into an underground chamber, not a natural formation, but something deliberately constructed, its walls lined with ancient stone that predated Versailles by centuries. At the bottom lay the remains of at least 20 bodies in various states of decomposition. Simon ordered the chamber sealed immediately and sent for the royal physicians to conduct a proper examination. But the well was only the beginning. As they explored further, following Marguerite's directions and Madame Genevieve's reluctant admissions, they discovered a network of rooms that existed in the palace's official plans but had been repurposed for uses no one had documented. Storage rooms that contained personal effects, clothing, shoes, small possessions that had belonged to the missing girls. One room held ledgers, meticulously kept records of servants who had departed over the past 15 years. The numbers were staggering. Not 12 disappearances, as Delacroix had documented. Not 20, as the bodies in the well suggested. Over 200 names. 200 girls who had come to Versailles seeking work and had never returned home. How? Simon demanded of Madame Genevieve, who sat in chains in a room that had once been her domain. How could this happen for 15 years without anyone noticing? The older woman's laugh was bitter, because no one cared enough to notice. These weren't the daughters of nobles. They were peasant girls, farm girls, the daughters of people who couldn't read and couldn't write, and couldn't make anyone in power listen even if they tried. Their parents came looking sometimes. We told them their daughters had run away. We told them to check the brothels in Paris. We told them anything except the truth, and they had no power to demand more. But you knew. You participated. I survived. Madame Genevieve's voice was hollow. The first supervisor I worked under showed me the well when I asked too many questions about a girl who disappeared. She gave me the same choice someone gave her years before: keep quiet or join the bodies below. I chose to live. And then she died, and I became the supervisor, and I gave the same choice to others. Who ordered this? Simon leaned forward. Someone must have authorized it. Someone must have decided that disposing of servants this way was acceptable. You want names. You want someone to blame. Madame Genevieve shook her head. It's not that simple. The palace is a machine, Your Grace. It consumes people, nobles, and servants alike. And no one person runs it. Oh, there are those who benefit from keeping things quiet. Officials who don't want to deal with the complications of proper investigations. Guards who were paid to look the other way. Kitchen supervisors who found it easier to have troublesome servants disappear than to manage them properly. But who gave the first order? Who decided this was how things should be done? That's lost to history, if it ever existed at all. The bodies in the well didn't put themselves there. No. That was usually me. Madame Genevieve's voice was matter of fact, as if she were describing a routine task, or my predecessor. Girls who became problems who asked too many questions, who threatened to go to authorities, who got pregnant and couldn't work anymore. They had to be dealt with. Sometimes it was quick, sometimes they fought. She looked at Marguerite. You would have fought, I think. That's why I tried to warn you off. It's easier when they don't fight. The silence that followed was absolute. Marguerite, standing against the wall with Anne, Marie beside her, felt something inside her break and reform in. Something harder. She had known, intellectually, what the well meant. But hearing Madame Genevieve describe it so casually, hearing the numbers, understanding the scale made it real in a way that seeing bones in the darkness had not. 200 girls, 200 families who'd sent their daughters to Versailles with hopes of better lives. 200 futures ended and discarded like refuse. You will stand trial, Saint, Simon said finally, and you will answer for every single death. Will I? Madame Genevieve smiled, showing teeth. We'll see what the courts actually do when they have to acknowledge that this happened in the Sun King's palace, under his roof, with his servants. We'll see how much justice matters when the reputation of Versailles is at stake. She was right to be skeptical. The investigation that Saint Simon launched shook the foundations of Versailles, but not in the way one might hope. Yes, Madame Genevieve was arrested. Yes, the well was properly excavated and the remains examined. Yes, the families of some of the victims, those who could be identified from the possessions found, were notified of their daughters' fates. But the scandal that should have erupted remained carefully contained. The king, when informed of the situation, was reportedly disturbed, but he was also pragmatic. Versailles was more than just his residence. It was a symbol of French power and civilization. To admit that such horrors had occurred within its walls for 15 years would damage France's reputation across Europe. It would give ammunition to critics who claimed that French nobility were decadent tyrants. It would raise uncomfortable questions about who knew what and when and why they'd done nothing. So the investigation was conducted quietly. The results were never made public, and the trial that followed was held behind closed doors. With no record kept for posterity, Marguerite was allowed to attend, along with Lieutenant de Lacroix and the Duc de Saint Simon. She sat in a small courtroom in a wing of the palace most servants never saw, and she watched as Madame Genevieve faced a panel of 3 judges. The testimony was damning. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The ledgers alone proved that Madame Genevieve had knowledge of hundreds of disappearances. The remains from the well, examined by royal physicians, showed evidence of violence, fractured skulls, broken necks, signs of strangulation. But as the trial progressed, something became clear. Madame Genevieve would not be the only one held accountable. Her defense, conducted by a lawyer appointed by the court, focused on a simple argument. She had been following established procedures. The well had existed before her tenure. The practice of disposing of problematic servants had been in place when she arrived. She had never acted on her own authority, but had always reported to her superiors, who had approved her actions. And those superiors, when called to testify, suddenly had very poor memories. The overseer of household staff claimed he'd never been told about specific disappearances, only that certain servants had departed. The palace chamberlain insisted he'd assumed all personnel matters were handled properly through normal channels. The captain of the Garde de Lac, was commanding officer, stated that he'd never received reports about missing servants, despite de Lac, while producing copies of 12 such reports, each one stamped with the captain's seal and marked case closed, no investigation required. It was a masterclass in institutional protection. Everyone claimed ignorance. Everyone insisted they'd been misled. And everyone tacitly agreed that this matter needed to be resolved quietly, efficiently, without causing undue embarrassment to His Majesty's court. In the end, the verdict surprised no one who understood how power worked. Madame Genevieve was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy to conceal crimes. She was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that would be carried out not in public, as was customary for such serious crimes, but in the prison courtyard at night, with no witnesses except the executioner and the required officials. No one else faced charges. The guards who'd been paid to ignore the disappearances were quietly transferred to distant posts. The officials who'd approved Madame Genevieve's actions retired with pensions intact. The system that had enabled 15 years of murder continued to function, only now with slightly more oversight and much more discretion. The families of the identified victims received compensation, 50 livres per girl, paid from a discretionary fund with no public record. They were also required to sign documents swearing they would not speak publicly about the circumstances of their daughters' deaths, under penalty of imprisonment for slander against the crown. Most signed. What choice did they have? Marguerite's family received no such payment. She was, after all, still alive. Instead, she received her wages for the 6 months she'd worked, the money she'd been promised, along with an additional sum of 100 livres, presented as a reward for faithful service. It was understood, though never explicitly stated, that this money came with the same expectation of silence as the death payments. She took it, she needed it, her family needed it, but she never stopped talking about what she'd seen. Pacing note. This section should feel disillusioning. The momentum of justice that seemed to be building should deflate into the reality of institutional self-protection. The execution of Madame Genevieve took place on a cold November night, 3 months after Marguerite's testimony had triggered the investigation. Marguerite was not invited to attend, but Lieutenant Delac told her about it afterward. The condemned woman had walked to the gallows with her head high, showing no emotion. She'd refused the services of a priest. When asked if she had any final words, she'd looked at the gathered officials and said simply, "I did what I was told. You know I did." No one responded. The executioner placed the noose around her neck. The trapdoor opened, and just like that, the woman who had overseen the deaths of hundreds of girls was gone. It should have felt like justice. Instead, it felt like a curtain being drawn, one final act to ensure that the show could continue without interruption. Delac had been at the execution. He told Marguerite that afterward, the officials had shared wine and discussed the upcoming hunting season as if they'd just completed a routine administrative task. As if they hadn't just witnessed the execution of a mass murderer whose crimes had occurred under their authority, with their tacit approval, for 15 years. "They'll forget this happened," Delac said, his voice bitter. "Give them a year, maybe 2, and it'll be as if none of it ever occurred. The records are already being sealed. The well is being filled in. The rooms we discovered are being repurposed. They're erasing the evidence of their own failure." "What about the girls?" Marguerite asked. "What about the 200 names in those ledgers?" "Most of them will never be identified. The remains we recovered were too decomposed, and the records don't include enough information to match them to specific missing persons. Some families will wonder for the rest of their lives what happened to their daughters. They'll never know that they died in a well beneath the most magnificent palace in Europe, killed because they were inconvenient." Marguerite felt the weight of those words settle over her like a shroud. She thought about the girls who'd traveled to Versailles with her that spring day that felt like a lifetime ago. Catherine had gone home after the investigation, taking the first opportunity to flee this place of horrors. Jean had stayed, grimly determined to earn the money she'd promised her family, though she now moved through the palace like a ghost. Anne Marie had become something harder, angrier, channeling her rage into organizing the other servant girls, teaching them their rights, making sure they knew they could report problems without fear. And Marguerite, she'd become a witness, a chronicler, someone who refused to let the story be buried completely. "I'm writing it down," she told Delacroix. "Everything that happened, everything I saw, everything you told me, I'm writing it all down, and I'm going to make sure it survives, even if the official records don't." "That's dangerous," Delacroix warned. "If the wrong people discover you're keeping a record." "I don't care anymore. These girls deserve to be remembered. Their names deserve to be spoken. And the people who let this happen deserve to have their failure documented." Marguerite's voice was steady, certain. "Someone has to bear witness. It might as well be me." Delacroix studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "If you're going to do this, do it carefully. Keep the document hidden. Don't tell anyone else about it. And when you leave Versailles, because you should leave as soon as you can, take it with you." "I will. One more thing." Delacroix reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper. "These are the names. All 207 of them, copied from the ledgers before they were sealed. I'm not supposed to have this. If anyone knows I made this copy, I'll be cashiered at best, imprisoned at worst. But you're right, these girls deserve to be remembered." Marguerite took the paper with trembling hands. The weight of it felt enormous, as if she were holding the lives themselves rather than just their names written in ink. That night, by candlelight, while the other girls slept, Marguerite began writing. She wrote about arriving at Versailles full of hope. She wrote about the harsh conditions, the endless work, the casual cruelty. She wrote about the disappearances, about the locked doors and the strange smells, about the well and what it contained. She wrote about the girls whose names appeared on Lieutenant Delacroix's list. 207 young women who'd come to Versailles seeking better lives and had found only death. She wrote about the trial, about the carefully maintained ignorance of those in power, about the way justice could be performed without actually being served. And she wrote about Madame Genevieve not as a monster, but as a woman who'd been given the same terrible choice Marguerite had been given, and who'd chosen differently, who'd chosen survival over resistance, silence over testimony, complicity over courage. Marguerite didn't excuse her, but she tried to understand her. The document she created over the following weeks was part testimony, part memorial, part accusation. It was the story that Versailles didn't want told. Written in careful script on papers she hid beneath the loose floorboard under her mattress. 3 months later, when her year of service was finally complete, Marguerite packed her few belongings and prepared to leave. Marie walked with her to the servants' entrance, the same entrance where they'd arrived together what felt like a lifetime ago. "You're really going?" Anne-Marie asked. "I have to. I can't breathe here anymore." "I understand." Anne-Marie embraced her. "Promise me something. Promise me you'll keep telling the story. Don't let them forget." "I promise." "And promise me you'll keep fighting. Not just for the girls who died here, but for all of us. For every servant girl who's treated like she's disposable. For every person who's told their life doesn't matter." Marguerite pulled back to look at her friend. "I promise." "What about you? What will you do?" Anne-Marie's smile was fierce. "I'm staying. Someone needs to make sure this never happens again. The servants here need to know their rights, need to know they can speak up without being thrown down a well. I'm going to make sure they know. Be careful. I will." "But I'm done being silent." They embraced once more, and then Marguerite walked through the gates of Versailles for the last time. She didn't look back. She couldn't bear to. The journey home to St. Leger and Yvelines took 2 days. When Marguerite arrived, her mother wept to see her. Her father counted the money she brought, more than he'd make in 5 years of farming, and wept too. Her sisters crowded around, asking questions about the palace, about the nobles, about life in the grandest building in France. Marguerite answered their questions carefully, editing the truth into something they could bear to hear. She told them about the long hours and the hard work. She told them about the magnificent gardens and the Hall of Mirrors. She told them that some girls had gotten sick and died, which was sad but not unusual in such a crowded place. She didn't tell them about the well, not yet, maybe not ever, but she kept the document hidden in her trunk, along with the list of names, and over the years that followed, as she married and had children and grew old in the same village where she'd been born, she added to it. She wrote about what happened next, how the reforms that had been promised at Versailles never quite materialized, how servant girls continued to disappear at a reduced but steady rate, how the palace developed new procedures that looked good on paper, but changed little in practice. She corresponded with Anne Marie, who stayed at Versailles for 5 more years before finally leaving to work for a noble family who treated their servants with something approaching decency. She exchanged letters with Lieutenant Delacroix, who was quietly forced into retirement after refusing to stop asking uncomfortable questions about palace security. And she wrote about the Duc de Saint, Simon, who included a heavily edited version of the scandal in his memoirs, careful to protect the identities of the guilty while making clear that something terrible had occurred in the palace's lower reaches. Historical note: the actual Duc de Saint, Simon's memoirs, published posthumously, do contain references to scandals involving servants, though nothing as specific as what's described here. His writings reveal a complex man who was often disturbed by the court's excesses, but remained part of the system that enabled them. Marguerite's document was never published in her lifetime. She was a farmer's daughter with limited education and no connections to the world of printers and publishers. Even if she'd had those connections, the content was too inflammatory, too dangerous. Publishing such accusations about Versailles even decades after the events could bring severe consequences. Instead, she kept it safe. She showed it to her children when they were old enough to understand. She insisted they read the names, all 207 of them. She made them understand that these were real people, girls not much older than they were, who'd been killed and forgotten. Remember them, she told her children. That's all we can do now. Remember them and make sure it matters that they lived. The document passed through generations of Marguerite's family. It was copied once, carefully, in case the original was lost. It survived wars and revolutions. It survived the fall of the monarchy and the execution of Louis Roman XVI's descendants. It survived the transformation of Versailles from an active palace to a museum, from a symbol of royal power to a tourist attraction, and in 1847, more than 150 years after the events it described, a descendant of Marguerite Bellancourt finally brought the document to a historian who was researching the daily life of servants in pre-revolutionary France. The historian, a woman named Elodie Rousseau, was initially skeptical. The story seemed too horrific, too dramatic. Surely if something like this had occurred, there would be other records, official documents, contemporary accounts, but as she investigated, she began finding corroboration in unexpected places. Parish records from villages around Versailles showed a pattern. Girls who left for the palace and whose families later filed death notices without ever recovering bodies. Court documents that referenced the execution of a woman named Genevieve Laurent in 1693 for crimes against servants, with all specific details sealed by royal order. Budget records showing unusual payments made to peasant families in 1693-1694, labeled only as royal charity. Most compelling of all, she found Lieutenant Delacroix's original reports. The 12 cases he'd documented filed in military archives that had somehow escaped periodic purges. The reports matched perfectly with names on Marguerite's list. Rousseau published her findings in 1851 in a scholarly journal with limited circulation. The article caused a minor scandal among historians but barely registered with the general public. By that time, France had gone through so many revolutions and counter-revolutions, had seen so much blood spilled in the name of liberty, and then order, and then liberty again, that the deaths of servant girls 150 years earlier seemed like ancient history. But the story survived. It was republished periodically, usually in the context of larger works about pre-evolutionary France or about the treatment of servants. It became a footnote in histories of Versailles, a dark chapter that contradicted the palace's image as a pinnacle of civilization. And most importantly, the names survived. 207 girls who might otherwise have been completely forgotten were remembered, their existence acknowledged, their deaths documented. It wasn't justice, not really. The people responsible had died centuries ago, beyond any earthly accounting. The system that had enabled the murders had been swept away by revolution, but it was witness, it was memory, it was proof that these lives had mattered, even when the powerful insisted they didn't. Today, if you visit Versailles, you can walk through the Hall of Mirrors and admire the way light reflects endlessly between the gilded surfaces. You can stroll through the gardens and marvel at the precision of landscaping. You can tour the royal apartments and imagine what it was like to live surrounded by such magnificence. The tour guides will tell you about Louis Roman XIV and his court. They'll describe the elaborate ceremonies, the political intrigues, the artistic achievements. They'll explain how Versailles represented the absolute power of the French monarchy and the pinnacle of Baroque architecture. What they probably won't tell you about is the well. It's still there, somewhere beneath the palace, filled in now, sealed, inaccessible, but there, nonetheless, along with all the other hidden spaces where the palace kept its secrets. The servant quarters have been converted to offices and storage. The narrow staircases that kept servants invisible are mostly blocked off now, considered too dangerous for modern building codes. The vast infrastructure that once supported thousands of servants has been largely dismantled or forgotten. But sometimes, workers doing maintenance in palaces' lower levels report strange things, cold spots that shouldn't exist, sounds that echo through empty corridors, a smell like old earth and older sorrows. Locals will tell you the palace is haunted. They'll speak of servant girls seen walking the grounds at night, dressed in clothes centuries out of style, searching for something they never found in life. Perhaps there's truth to these stories, perhaps the dead do linger in places where they suffered. Or perhaps it's just that some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you bury them. The historian Elodie Rousseau, who brought Marguerite's testimony to light, wrote in her 1851 article, "We speak of Versailles as a triumph of human achievement, a testament to what can be built when power and wealth converge. But every triumph casts a shadow, and in that shadow lived thousands of people whose labor made the triumph possible. To understand Versailles truly, we must look at both the light and the darkness. We must remember not just the kings who ruled from golden thrones, but also the servant girls who scrubbed those thrones, who paid for splendor with their sweat, their health, and sometimes their lives. The story of the disappeared servants of Versailles is a reminder that history has many layers. The version recorded in official documents, preserved in museums, taught in schools. That's only one layer. Beneath it lie countless other stories, of the poor and the powerless, of those who built and cleaned and served and died without leaving names in the history books. Marguerite Bellancourt's testimony survived because she was brave enough to resist, because she found allies who chose to care, and because her descendants understood that remembering matters. But for every story like hers that survived, how many were lost? How many other wells exist, metaphorically or literally, filled with the remains of people history chose to forget? These questions don't have comfortable answers. What we know is this: between 1678, when Versailles became the official seat of the French court, and 1789, when the revolution forced the royal family back to Paris, approximately 40 servants worked at the palace. Most left no trace in the historical record beyond perhaps a name in a payroll ledger. Their stories, their struggles, their fates, all lost to time. Were there other Madame Genevieve, other Wells, other systematic disposals of inconvenient lives? We'll probably never know for certain. The records are gone, destroyed or sealed, or simply never kept in the first place. The people who knew the truth are centuries dead. Even the physical spaces where these crimes occurred have been altered beyond recognition. But Marguerite's testimony suggests that what happened in 1693 wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a glimpse into routine practices that the powerful preferred to keep hidden. It suggests that the magnificent palace we admire today was built not just on the labor of servants, but sometimes on their bones. This doesn't mean we should stop appreciating Versailles as an architectural marvel. Beauty and horror can coexist in the same space. Genius and cruelty can emerge from the same culture. The palace remains an extraordinary achievement of human creativity and ambition. But we honor those who suffered by remembering them alongside those who triumphed. We honor Marguerite Bellancourt by telling her story. We honor the 207 girls whose names she preserved by speaking those names aloud, by acknowledging that they lived, that they mattered, that their deaths were not inevitable or acceptable, but were crimes that should have prompted justice and reform. We honor them by learning the lesson their story teaches, that no achievement, however magnificent, justifies treating human beings as disposable. That silence in the face of cruelty is its own form of cruelty. That bearing witness even when it's dangerous, even when it seems futile, is a moral imperative. Marguerite Bellancourt died in 1747 at the age of 69 in the village where she'd been born. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her bed as she passed peacefully in her sleep. She'd lived a long life by the standards of her era, longer than the girls whose names she'd preserved, longer than they'd ever had the chance to. Her last words, according to family records, were, "Don't forget." They didn't, and now neither will you. The story of Versailles' disappeared servants challenges us to think about whose stories get told and whose get buried. It reminds us that history is written by the survivors, and that the magnificent buildings we preserve often have foundations built on suffering we'd prefer to ignore, but it also demonstrates the power of individual courage. Marguerite Bellancourt was an uneducated 15-year-old farm girl with no power, no connections, no resources beyond her own determination that some things were too important to ignore. She couldn't save the girls who'd already died. She couldn't reform the system that had killed them, but she could witness. She could testify. She could preserve their names, and centuries later, we remember those names because she refused to forget them. That's a kind of victory, even if it's not the victory we'd prefer. Even if justice came too late for most and never came at all for some. Even if the powerful escaped accountability and the system continued largely unchanged. Memory matters, witness matters, truth matters. These girls lived, they worked, they suffered, and they died in a well beneath a palace that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of human civilization. We can't change what happened to them, but we can make sure it matters that they existed. We can speak their names, we can tell their story, we can carry forward Marguerite Bellancourt's determination that silence is not acceptable when facing horror. If this journey through one of Versailles' darkest chapters has moved you, if you find yourself thinking about the girls whose names survived and the countless others whose names were lost, then consider what that means for how we view history. Consider how many stories remain buried beneath the monuments we celebrate. Consider whose voices we're still not hearing, whose suffering we're still ignoring, whose lives we're still treating as less important than the comfort of those in power. And consider what you might witness in your own time, what injustices exist in plain sight that we've learned not to see, what suffering occurs in the shadows of our own magnificent achievements, what future Marguerite Bellancourt might look back at us and wonder why we stayed silent. These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. The servant girls of Versailles deserved better than they got. They deserved to live full lives, to grow old, to be more than just names on a list. We can't give them that. We can't undo their deaths, but we can refuse to let them be forgotten. We can insist that their lives mattered. We can carry their story forward. If this account has provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it's made you think about justice and memory and the way power operates, then let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts on how we remember history, on whose stories survive and whose are lost. Tell us if you've encountered other examples of forgotten voices being recovered from the silence. Subscribe to this channel if you believe these stories deserve to be told. There are many more mysteries waiting in history's shadows, many more voices that were silenced but left echoes we can still hear if we listen carefully enough. And until we meet again for the next journey through history's forgotten corners, remember this: every monument has a foundation. Every achievement has a cost. Every story we celebrate exists alongside countless stories we've forgotten. Our task is to remember them all, not to diminish beauty, but to understand it fully, not to destroy what's been built, but to acknowledge what it was built upon, not to ignore the light, but to also see the shadows. Welcome to the Untold Hour, where history's silenced voices finally speak. Don't forget.